Hi, my name is Stephen Dalton, and welcome to Tales from the House. Normally, I'm a school teacher, and I get to talk to children about history and try and enthuse them with wonderful stories from the past. But I can't really do that now when we're all in lockdown, shut in our houses. So I thought I'd tell you some stories from the past. Hence, Tales from my house, from the house. That's what I do. So let's go. This is April the 11th. I'm going to try and do something like this every day. And I'm going to try and pick events from the past that are both interesting, significant, momentous, but most of all, kind of fun. I won't be able to do all of them, and they'll vary across the time period. But let's give it a go, see what happens. April the 11th, today, I've got 3 events that are all quite modern. So let's begin. April 11th, 1970. The launch of Apollo 13. And I can show you the launch of Apollo 13 right here, right now. Let's have a go, shall we? Where is it? There we are. You should be able to see that kind of now, I think. Yes, here's the launch of Apollo 13. Let's have a listen. Clear of the tower. Yes, I mean, I know what you're thinking. It looks like it's about to fall over at some point, but it isn't. 50 years on from that launch today, it's still an impressive sight seeing Apollo 13 take off like that. It's just quite incredible. Well, what is significant about Apollo 13? You may have seen the Ron Howard movie. You may well know that it was supposed to be the 3rd mission to land on the moon, but it never made it. 2 days into space, an oxygen tank exploded. They lost power, they lost oxygen, they weren't going to make it. They had to try and figure out how to get back, and it was a near-run thing. I suppose it adds to the idea that 13 is an unlucky number, but they did make it back. When the problem occurred and the explosion happened, the commander, this man, Jim Lovell, who's an amazing character, I'll tell you about him, uttered in response to Houston checking initially what had been said, these famous words. Houston, we've had a problem. Not like Ron Howard says in the movie, we have a problem. I can understand why they changed the tense. It works better for suspense if the problem is not yet solved. But yeah, they had a big problem. Jim Lovell, though, managed to steer the crew safely back with a lot of help from the ground support at Houston. And Jim Lovell himself is quite an amazing man in space terms. He's the first person to go into space four times. Yeah, I mean, we'll never get to go once unless you can pay for a ticket on Elon Musk's rocket launches. I don't know. But he's been 4 times. He's also the first person, one of only 3, well, maybe not the first, but he's one of only 3 to go to the moon twice. So all you people out there who think the moon landings didn't happen, speak to Jim Lovell because he's still alive today. Yes, you can speak to him. He's about 92 years old, and he can tell you what it's like to be on the moon. Oh, wait, he was supposed to go. I mean, he went there twice. He didn't land. I mean, he orbited a lot of times on 2 separate occasions, but I'm pretty sure he knows what it would have been like. In any case, there's Jim Lovell. Let's move on to 1979 and the eviction of Idi Amin as dictator from the East African country of Uganda. It was the neighboring country, Tanzania. And yes, it is called Tanzania. I've been there. It's not Tanzania. They call themselves Tanzanians. Tanzania went insane here on their neighbor Uganda and booted out the 8-year dictator Idi Amin, who had a terrible reputation, accused, probably wrongly so, of cannibalism, but rightly so of brutality. The numbers of people he killed in purges and suspicions and paranoia go into the hundreds of thousands, some estimates even as high as 500,000. And this is a small country. It's not that big. In any case, he was booted out by Tanzania in 1979. But despite all of the ridiculousness of the man, he was 6'4". He was very powerful. He was very charismatic. He was legitimately the Ugandan heavyweight boxing champion for 9 years. But, you know, he did odd things like offer himself for a state visit, invited himself for a state visit to Britain, which Britain didn't take up. I mean, it's supposed to be the other way around. You're supposed to be invited by the country, but he invited himself to go there. He supported the independence movement of Scotland by declaring himself the king of the last king of Scotland, so that he could lead their independence against Britain. In any case, all of the odd things that happened to him, his reputation in Africa and in Uganda is not entirely bad. Some people there still think quite nice things of him. Have a look at this.
He made himself this Superman, this demigod who could do things that hadn't done before. He could dare the British. He could dare the Americans. He could anybody. He threatened to go to South Africa and kick up the Boers. He was that type of guy. He recruited people. He offered aid to the British. that was funny. He was a funny guy. Idi Amin, most amazing man there's ever been. The general, the president, the king on the scene.
Idi Amin, the most amazing man, king of the sea. I'm sure that was all their own doing, and they just felt the need to praise him. I don't think they were encouraged to do that at all. But in any case, thrown out today, April the 11th, 1979. And this brings me on to the last thing I want to talk about, which is this man here, a man called Gerald Bull. Now, nothing happened to him in April 11th, but something that he made was captured. The world's largest ever supergun, made by this guy, was discovered leaving customs and export in Middlesbrough. Probably the most famous thing Middlesbrough has ever done, to seize this supergun, the world's largest ever supergun, on its way to Iraq. Well, what kind of weird story is this? It's not a made-up story. This is not your Tony Blair, George Bush weapons of mass destruction. No, this is 1990. This is the first Gulf War, where Iraq had invaded Kuwait. What is this supergun? You may have forgotten about it. Well, let me tell you, like all amazing, ridiculous large weaponry, it has its origins, yeah, you guessed it, somewhere back with the Nazis. Well, let me show you. Slightly before that, in fact. Here, you've got a gun from 1918 called the Paris gun, which could fire shells 75 miles. And the objective was to fire from the German front lines to bomb Paris. And in fact, they did do about 200 odd times. But it didn't do much to damage morale, and it couldn't damage very much in terms of, infrastructure and building. But I mean, it looks like it's got half the Brooklyn Bridge sat on top of it as some sort of support crane suspension. But that's the inspiration, 1918. And then in World War II, this supergun technology was developed by the Nazis. Here is the longest gun ever made. It's not the second longest gun ever made. Obviously, the longest gun was discovered today, April the 11th in 1990. But I'm coming to that. This is its origins. This is the Nazi supergun, the London gun, more popularly known as the V3. Yes, I thought they were rockets. The V1 was the Doodlebug bomb, and the V2 was the rocket jet-propelled one, and this was the V3. It never got into full functioning mode, but it could fire from Calais, where it was angled on a hill, and I can show you that here, actually. I think there it is, angled on a hill. Ooh. It's 134 meters long, the barrel. And the objective was to fire from Calais all the way over the channel to smash London. And it could do that. Amazing. At a rate of 300 shells per hour. Happily, 165 kilometer range, sorry. At a rate of 300 shells per hour. Happily, it never got functioning because the Allies bombed it. But in theory, this worked. How? Well, because they had this. They used to fire from here the shell, and as it passed along this ridiculous 130-meter barrel, at periodic times, just as it passed, there were timed rocket propulsion firings that would increase the speed, and that's why they're distanced further apart as they traveled faster, to increase the speed, to give it that punch up into the air so that it could travel such a great distance. I mean, this is remarkable. 1943, 1944, that they had this sort of rocket-propelled, rocket-assisted propelled supergun. And you'll see that technology was used. Because after the war, what happened? Well, of course, all of this stuff was gathered up by the Americans and taken back to investigate. And they did. They didn't put much stock in it. After a couple of years, it was discontinued. But it was revived by our man Gerald Bull, who was a Canadian working in conjunction with the Canadian-American governments on a new project in the 1960s to revive supergun technology, the HARP project, the High Altitude Research Project. And here is the US-Canadian military project, the HARP gun. It's not as big. It's only about 36 meters, and it is, in fact, two naval guns simply welded together. But they're testing the technology, and his idea was that you could launch small satellites into space simply by firing them into space. I mean, that's incredible. This project ran in the mid 60s until about 66, 67, when money became a problem. But this gun, this is in Barbados, by the way, and you can still go and see it. It still sits on the cliffside, if there is a cliff or the beach or whatever, and it's rusting away. You can still go and take a photograph with it, the Supergun, because this is a big thing. This gun here regularly sent items into the ionosphere, over 80 kilometers high. Well, how big is that? It's this big. I mean, it's well above where planes fly. It's 15 kilometers high. It's well above the ozone layer and the stratosphere. It's into the mesosphere. In fact, it's above that. It's into the thermosphere. It's not far from where satellites fly. That you can fire something into space is incredible. So what happened to this gun? Well, the HARP project was discontinued. They pumped into it about 11.25 million, I think. And in today's money, that's about $250 million into this project. And it just wasn't getting far enough. And by 1966, 67, the Americans have decided to pursue rocket technology in order to get to the moon. I mean, you weren't going to launch a person in this. You were going to launch stuff, bits for building supplies. You could fire satellites. So it's not going to launch a person. And financial constraints of the Vietnam War meant that, things were discontinued. So the HARP project got discontinued. And poor Gerald Bull, who was convinced that this would be much better, decided he wanted to try and continue the project. This gun, by the way, still holds the record for firing something the furthest into space. It once fired an 80-kilogram object, I think it was 80-kilogram object, 179 kilometers into space. That actually went into orbit for a period of time. That's incredible. And that is, to date, still a world record. But nevertheless, when the project was discontinued, Bull was given all of the equipment and the sites. Here is a site in Yuma where you can still see some of these guns taken from above. It's genuinely massive. And he was encouraged to create his own business, which he did, called the Space Research Corporation. And he wanted to pursue this technology of supergun orbit satellite launches, which he was convinced would be much cheaper and better. The idea was that you could launch this stuff, and although he could put stuff into space, with bigger stuff, you could launch it, and then as it cleared up into the ionosphere, you could use rocket propulsion for a second stage to clear Earth's atmosphere entirely and get into orbit. And that would be much, much cheaper. To give you some idea of what Gerald Bull's calculations worked out at, he thought that you could launch stuff into space. And think about this, supplies, space station, buildings, stuff like that, or the immense amount of satellites. He thought you could launch something into space for about $1,700. I mean, I can afford to do that. You could too, maybe. That's amazing. Today, $1,700 per kilogram. Today, to give you some idea, it cost NASA $22,000 per kilogram to launch something. So this was infinitely cheaper technology if it had been pursued. But it couldn't be. No more funding. So the Space Research Corporation that Gerald Bull now headed, owning these sites, decided to go and try and pursue his funding through other means. And that meant working for other people. So he did. He ended up building missiles and working for China, Taiwan, South Africa. He was even arrested in 1977 for breaking the arms embargo, the UN arms embargo to apartheid Africa, and jailed for 4 months. When he came out, he moved to Brussels, and he decided he had to try to, get some money from somewhere. So he went back to offering his services, and that's where this man came along. Saddam Hussein in 1981 inquired, "Excuse me, would you be able to build this supergun so that we could do something like that?" Yes, he said. And by 1988, in Baghdad, he concluded a $25 million deal to build the world's largest supergun. And I am not making this up. We know this is true because it was seized at the customs depot by MI6 and customs officials leaving Middlesbrough. Here it is. You can go and see bits of it today. This is it. It's in the Royal Armouries in York. And you can see another section of it at the Imperial War Museum up the road from me in Duxford. this is it. It just looks like enormous piping. It was made by Sheffield Steel Corporation, and it was exported through Middlesbrough to go and be parts of a 156-meter Supergun that was going to, much like the Nazi one, rest against the side of a hill. It would be able to fire things 1,000 kilometers. It could bomb cities in Iran. It could obliterate Tel Aviv. And obviously this is rather scary stuff. But it could also launch rocket-assisted satellites into space. And Saddam Hussein, for a very sort of cheap price, could enter the sort of space race and have, powerful weapons, and that sort of cheap stuff appealed to him. So Gerald Bull ended up taking the job. They actually built a small version, but the large one never actually got built because the parts going to build it were seized on this day in 1990. 30 years ago, they built this Supergun. So what happened? Well, Gerald Bull never got to see it seized because 1 month before the 11th of April, when it was seized, he was assassinated outside his front door in Brussels. 3 bullets, point-blank range to his back and 2 in the back of his head. And that was the end of poor old Gerald Bull. And as for Saddam Hussein, well, he ended up in another war about 8 years later, which toppled him. He never got his Supergun, and neither did the world ever get to see if Gerald Bull's technology could work. Are we ever likely to see a Supergun again? Who knows? Maybe we will, maybe we won't. People seem obsessed with rocket technology, but the potential for this to be much cheaper is there. However, I don't think we're going to see it. It's too tainted. Who wants to take up the mantle of developing weapons used by Saddam Hussein and furthered by the Nazis? Just doesn't have a nice ring to it. In any case, there you go. That's the end. Let's finish there, and I will see you, hopefully, tomorrow. This has been History for the 11th of April. See you later. Bye-bye.